Morning. Had a moment of freak out there where I thought I wasn't going to connect me, but we're good. So, obviously, if that ever happens, I will let you all know. How's everybody doing? How was everyone's weekend?
Good. I decorated for Halloween.
Nice! Oh my gosh, yeah, that's coming up. I don't know how that's going to work this year. I don't know if we're going to be able to trick or treat or not. Probably not. Makes me a little sad. It's like one of the most fun parts of being an adult is getting to see all the little kiddos in their costumes that come to your door.
And matching your outfit with your kids too.
Yes, I've done that for sure.
I'm just gonna yeet the treats.
Nice. I approve. All right. Did anyone do anything fun over the weekend?
I got to go
I
water
worked.
skiing.
And then someone else said something else?
I got to go water skiing on my boat this weekend. It was fun.
Oh, nice. People still water ski. That's exciting. I remember when they made the new Whole Foods out in Virginia Beach, and they hung all those water skis over the registers. People were like, "Why are they using water skis? No one water skis anymore." I'm like, "People still water ski." I'm just checking y'all in right now, making sure everybody gets attendance and you're all here, all that good stuff. Everybody still feeling pretty good about mask wearing on campus and whatnot? People seem to be keeping it up.
I'm from Lynchburg, and I went back to pick up some stuff for school before class started. And it's so weird because the mindset around wearing masks and taking prevention and precaution and social distancing seriously is so just not there. My boyfriend and I walked through the mall, and there was so many people just not wearing masks, so many people all up on each other, so many people doing the chin strap or the schnoz.
I hate that.
And several people walking through the mall like this, holding their shirts over their face. I'm
yeah, so far I've only been in places where people are pretty good about it. So, but granted, I only really leave my house to go to medical appointments. So that might be a big part of it too.
We were walking through, and both of us are wearing masks, and we're both like, are we in the Twilight Zone?
Yeah, I hate to be this person, but I took my car in just for state inspection a couple weeks ago, and they were definitely all doing the schnoz. And so I got the how did they do survey, and one of the questions on there now is how compliant were they with mask wearing? And I was like, well, just so as you know.
Did you get your car fixed from last week?
Oh yeah, it turns out it was my battery. And AAA came, and the weird nice thing is that because they replaced my battery only 3 years ago, I got a prorated one because they're supposed to be good for 6 years. So it was sort of the best of all worlds. I knew it was the battery because it wasn't even trying to turn over, but it was just in the moment, there was nothing you could do about it, right? All right, cool. Well, I wanted to start by screen sharing the syllabus today. So let me start with that. Just because you do have your first assignment coming up where you're going to read from the Pieces book. So for the Pieces book, you're going to see author names. And so when you look in the table of contents in the Pieces book, these are the names of the authors of the particular reading you're going to do. And then there's also a reading on Blackboard, which if you go to our Blackboard page, hang on just a sec, I will go ahead and open up a window for y'all. Maybe. Gotta get it to go on the other screen, hang on. Having two screens can be a blessing, but it also can be really obnoxious sometimes. All right. Advisor. There we go. If you go on our Blackboard page, there is, and just so you know now, the recordings of class are here now too. So if you do miss a day, those are here. And they're on YouTube, so they are closed captioned too. So if you need that, that is there. But if you go here, there is Blackboard readings. And so what you'll see is there are 2 short readings for Wednesday posted here. So you just click on them and you can either read them here or you can print them out if you prefer that. Yeah, Carly.
I was just curious for Wednesday. I know we have an in-class assignment, so would you prefer if we were on our phones or our laptops, or it doesn't really matter?
It doesn't really matter. Basically, the in-class assignment is going to be what I did. What is it, gender choice class, which I think I'll do for you all too, is I just made it a Google Doc you all just open a copy of in your group, and then you just answer the questions on that. So as long as one group member has access to a proper tablet to make that a little easier, you should be fine. You'll be ready
Okay, cool.
that day. And so, yeah, it'll just be, oops, sorry, Carly, I accidentally muted you when I meant to lower your hand. So if you feel free to unmute yourself.
You're okay. No, I was just wondering. Thank you.
Yeah, so it'll just be reflecting on the readings as a group. You'll get, 15, 20 minutes to do that, and then we'll come back together and discuss it.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. All right. Any other questions about the readings? It will be the first time we're going into the Pieces book and our Blackboard readings. And so what you'll see is the Blackboard readings are going to be trying to decolonize the syllabus and not just have white people. And it's going to talk about things like, how do we decide who's actually a famous psychologist or an eminent psychologist? So hopefully you all find those interesting and helpful. All right, any other questions about stuff coming up in the class or how things are going so far? I know, again, it's a weird situation that we're all looking at each other as little boxes on the screen, but.
For some reason, when I try to open up the slides on Blackboard, like I have a Mac, and for some reason they're not opening for me.
Oh, weird. Okay. Shoot me an email and I'll try emailing them to you and see if it works that way.
Okay, yeah, those are just like they're like lecture slides, right? Or is that
Yep,
like
yeah, so you should have the exact same PowerPoints I have, essentially.
Okay.
Are the PDF ones, but those are set up so that it's like 3 slides on a page and then the notes next to them.
Yeah, I tried to access both and they would not open for me. I was like,
Okay,
what's going on?
yeah.
I'll
I'll try emailing it to you.
Okay.
If not, then we can talk to IT and see.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you.
No problem. Alrighty. Anyone else having any issues with Blackboard or any of the other fun technology we get to interact with? Cool. If you have Blackboard questions in particular about signing in, things like that, you talk to Robin Takis. She has an office on first floor Clark. And she's just like the nicest lady ever. So she would be very glad to help you. Alrighty, well, I am going to get our PowerPoint going for today. We're going to pick up where we left off. So we had just talked about correlation. We're going to talk about experiments today. So let me get this up and going so that I can share screen with you all. There we go. All right, and pull up the chat in case y'all need to ask any questions. And obviously, if I don't see you in the chat, feel free to unmute as well. So I think I finally figured out how to orchestrate this best. So I'm just gonna put the chair totally out of the way, and then I don't run into it. Whoa, what a novel concept. Okay. I couldn't move it sideways because Simba's like right here on the ground. Okay. Picking back up here. And get my clicker up and running here. Good morning, clicker. Okay. So we had just talked about correlations and how they can end up giving you a lot of really valuable information, but you still can't determine causality, right? So in order to do that, we do need to do an experiment. And so an experiment allows for determination of causal relation between two variables because you are the one manipulating that. So you can directly see how your manipulation affects everything else. So the experiment involves random assignment of participants to experimental conditions. We'll talk more about that on the next slide. Manipulation of an independent variable. This is often called an IV, and this is believed to be what your causal variable is, what's going to cause a change. So for example, you know, maybe you're trying to, we mentioned talking about like how do you induce feelings of depression, right? So maybe you play sad music for half your participants and the other ones are randomly assigned to hear happier music or sort of more neutral music, right? And then you're going to measure your dependent variable. And that's what's assumed to be controlled by the IV. So in this case, the example I just gave, you would want to measure depression to make sure you actually induced it, basically. And it sounds so weird that we like want to induce depression in people, but it is how we learn about things. And we do it in ways that can be as safe as possible for our participants. And we always sort of undo it at the end. So statistics and research design are very important in experimental design. Researchers must eliminate all confounds, which are also sometimes called nuisance variables. These are variables other than the independent variable that could affect your dependent variable. So you want to try to guard against those as much as you can because they can skew your results. So the example I always give is, let's say you're doing an experiment where you have people like paying attention to try to remember like a word list or something. If you have a day, right, where there's like construction going on right outside the window or the fire alarm goes off, right? You're probably going to have to throw out that data because that's a huge confound. The person's not going to be able to pay attention, right? You know, so you try to like find another space on campus to hold the experiment if you know there's going to be construction that day. Obviously, you can't always control for everything, but if you can plan around it, you try to. So a lot of the ways you do this is by having a control group. So a control group is a group of participants who are not exposed to the independent variable, but whose experience is similar. So for the example I just gave of the depression study, the people who would get the like neutral or happy music, right? So you want to know if it's just the experience of coming into the lab and listening to music that makes people feel depressed. We hope not, right? Or if it is the experience of actually listening to the sad music. And by comparing the outcome of each group, we can better determine how much the independent variable is actually affecting things. Random assignment ensures that every participant in the experiment is as likely to be placed in one group as another. Old school ways of doing this are actually just to flip a coin, or I've seen people do it where there's like the group numbers in a hat and they just have someone pull it out and, oh, okay, you're group one today. The way that I typically do it now, the like high-tech way, is there's a website called random.org, and it contains a random number generator. So you can say, hey, I've got 4 participants coming in today, and I need them to be randomized to groups 1 and 2. And it'll randomly assign them. It'll come up with a list of 4 numbers in a row for you, which is really great, really helpful because there's absolutely no bias, right? The computer's just literally randomly spitting stuff out. So that's how I typically do it now. And actually, even when I give tests, that's how I do my multiple choice, is I actually use random.org to randomize them to make sure I'm not like making every answer D or something. Blind design becomes really important when we're talking about therapy designs in particular. So a blind design is built around the idea of the placebo effect or placebo therapy. And this is the idea that you try to substitute an imitation, essentially something that looks or feels like a real therapeutic treatment, but isn't. So this is really easy to figure out how to do when we're doing medication, right? So you have the medication with the active ingredients for your experimental group, and then your control group would get usually just a sugar pill. So it's a sugar pill that is shaped and colored exactly like your actual medication. And then you would give that to the person, and essentially you try to determine, is that person just getting better because they think they're getting help, right? We know that people just like, even when they're like waiting to see a doctor, start feeling better because they know they're going to get help. Or is it actually that they're feeling better because of the medication? So any effects the experimental group show over and above what the control group shows in terms of improvement tells us that yes, this medication is actually working. Obviously, this gets trickier, right, when we're trying to do this with therapy, right? So like, what is a placebo for therapy, right? Is it just talking to the person? Well, that's sort of actually a therapeutic technique we'll talk about later in the semester called humanistic therapy. So like, right? So sometimes what you do is you put people on a wait list and compare therapy to that, that you do get that sort of hopeful effect. Or sometimes you will sort of compare to what we call treatment as usual. So you give the therapy that typically works, and then you see if your new type of therapy actually works better. So the reason we use placebo therapy and blind design is to try to get rid of experimenter bias, which is sometimes also called the Rosenthal effect. And this is where experimenters may have expectations that they unintentionally transmit to their participants. And the way I always describe this is, if you give someone the same medication, read the same script to them, you can still give stuff away, right? So if you say, here's the medication, I think it's really gonna help with your symptoms, right? Versus, here's the medication, this is really gonna help with your symptoms, right? And again, it doesn't have to be that extreme, it doesn't have to be my bad acting, right? But essentially, it allows you to, you unintentionally transmit what you think is gonna happen to the person. Again, no matter how much you try to control your own behavior. So blind design tries to account for that. So a single blind design, the participant doesn't know if they're being given the real treatment or not. So the participant doesn't know, is this just sugar pill? Is this the active ingredients? A double blind design is where neither the participant nor the researcher knows. So you would have someone who knows, probably the principal investigator, right? And then you would have research assistants who would be the ones who came in every morning and give the medication to the people. And you would have like medication A, medication B. They would just be labeled, and you know which one was which would switch throughout the experiment. Someone would have control behind the scenes, but you on that day would have no idea which you're handing to them. Now, how well does that work? Depending on the medication, can be questionable. One of my grad school professors told us a story about work he did with kids with ADHD, and they would come in for the behavioral observation, and they would say, it's a placebo day, because it just wouldn't be working. And so the kids do the difference, right? So sometimes it's pretty obvious, but other times, you know, the placebo gives that hope effect. So single blind design, the participant doesn't know. Double blind design, the participant doesn't know and the researcher doesn't know. Triple blind design is where any sort of judges rating the human behavior also don't know. So in psychology, we might do this one of several ways. So for the study my grad school professor was working on, they actually just stood there with clipboards and like made observations about the kiddos. You might do it behind one of those one-way mirrors, right? So the person might know they're being watched, but not, you know, who's watching them or how they're being rated. Or a lot of times what we do for therapy is we actually videotape it, obviously with the participant's consent, and then it's rated by someone later. And then again, in the case of a triple blind design, they wouldn't know whether this is supposed to be the active treatment or not. They would just be rating what behaviors they see. So I do have a little video to show y'all about the placebo effect. So let me do a new share here, because I think it's helpful to see what this looks like. And the captions are on just in case the sound is wonky for y'all.
In 1996, 56 volunteers took part in a study to test a new painkiller called Trivaricane. On each subject, one index finger was covered in the new painkiller, while the other remained untouched. Then, both were squeezed in painful clamps. The subjects reported that the treated finger hurt less than the untreated one. This shouldn't be surprising, except Trivaricane wasn't actually a painkiller, just a fake concoction with no pain-easing properties at all. What made the students so sure this dummy drug had worked? The answer lies in the placebo effect, an unexplained phenomenon wherein drugs, treatments, and therapies that aren't supposed to have an effect and are often fake miraculously make people feel better. Doctors have used the term placebo since the 1700s, when they realized the power of fake drugs to improve people's symptoms. These were administered when proper drugs weren't available, or if someone imagined they were ill. In fact, the word placebo means "I shall please" in Latin, hinting at a history of placating troubled patients. Placebos had to mimic the real treatments in order to be convincing, so they took the form of sugar pills, water-filled injections, and even sham surgeries. Soon, doctors realized that duping people in this way had another use: in clinical trials. By the 1950s, researchers were using placebos as a standard tool to test new treatments. To evaluate a new drug, for instance, half the patients in a trial might receive the real pill. The other half would get a placebo that looked the same. Since patients wouldn't know whether they'd receive the real thing or a dud, the results wouldn't be biased, researchers believed. Then, if the new drug showed a significant benefit compared to the placebo, it was proved effective. Nowadays, it's less common to use placebos this way because of ethical concerns. If it's possible to compare a new drug against an older version or another existing drug, that's preferable to simply giving someone no treatment at all, especially if they have a serious ailment. In these cases, placebos are often used as a control to fine-tune the trial, so that the effects of the new versus the old or alternative drug can be precisely compared. But of course, we know that placebos exert their own influence too. Thanks to the placebo effect, patients have experienced relief from a range of ailments, including heart problems, asthma, and severe pain, even though all they'd received was a fake drug or sham surgery. We're still trying to understand how. Some believe that instead of being real, the placebo effect is merely confused with other factors, like patients trying to please doctors by falsely reporting improvements. On the other hand, researchers think that if a person believes a fake treatment is real, their expectations of recovery actually do trigger physiological factors that improve their symptoms. Placebos seem to be capable of causing measurable change in blood pressure, heart rate, and the release of pain-reducing chemicals like endorphins. That explains why subjects in pain studies often say placebos ease their discomfort. Placebos may even reduce levels of stress hormones like adrenaline, which can slow the harmful effects of an ailment. So shouldn't we celebrate the placebo's bizarre benefits? Not necessarily. If somebody believes a fake treatment has cured them, they may miss out on drugs or therapies that are proven to work. Plus, Plus, the positive effects may fade over time, and often do. Placebos also cloud clinical results, making scientists even more motivated to discover how they wield such power over us. Despite everything we know about the human body, there are still some strange and enduring mysteries, like the placebo effect. So what other undiscovered marvels might we contain? It's easy to investigate.
I always love that. Like, this is just a video on the placebo effect, but now we're going to try to answer all the things all the time, right? But I like that because it does show a little bit about it, and it mentions the ethical issues, which I think are really important to consider, right? Like, especially if we know there's a medication or a therapy that does work, right? Is it ethical not to give the person that? Probably not, right? And so that's why, again, a lot of things are now like compared to treatment as usual or a wait list, where the person's going to get the actual treatment, but just maybe in 4 weeks. Just like the correlational method, the experimental method does have extensions of it. So you can do more with it than just sort of these very carefully controlled lab trials. So one is quasi-experiments. So these involve examining distances that actually exist in groups without random assignment, things you can't randomly assign. So you can't ethically cause someone to develop a phobia, for example, or to experience child abuse. Never would we want to do that, right? So you would compare these individuals with matched control subjects who don't experience those things, and you would match them on important factors for your study, like maybe age or developmental period. Natural experiments occur when nature itself or a larger man-made phenomenon manipulates the independent variable. For example, natural experiments may examine the effects of such events as the hurricane, such as the one that went through Louisiana last week, or terrorist attacks. So I always talk about September 11th. I know for many of y'all, you were like super young and it might not be that much of a thing that stands out for you. I was in college when it happened. So September 11th really is sort of my flashbulb memory. I remember everything about how I learned about it. I remember the events of that whole day. So in the wake of September 11th, there was a lot of interest and clinical concern to examine the effects of experiencing these attacks on those who had loved ones who were victims or who witnessed attacks or who provided services afterwards. So they include things like predictors of developing PTSD after the attacks, the effectiveness of therapy for those affected by the attacks, and even such considerations as the higher incidence of alcoholism among Red Cross workers who helped after the attacks. So obviously we would never want to like create a terrorist attack or a natural disaster to study, right? Like, God no. But when it does happen, then we are able to actually go in and see what works to help people. And so, for example, what we learned about, especially like rescue workers, first responders in the wake of September 11th, really helps with other natural disasters. So, for example, I have a friend from grad school who was essentially almost like deployed. He's not in the military, but he was sent to Japan after the tsunami and reactor meltdown there, and used techniques there to help people that we developed after September 11th. So again, horrible event, never want it to happen again, but what we learned from that helped in that situation, and I would imagine is helping first responders who are dealing with COVID. Because, for example, the cleanup after September 11th took such a long time. It's a prolonged trauma, right? And we see that with things like COVID as well. I'm just looking here. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense that, you know, a lot of things are in the head. And sometimes when you're convinced you're gonna die, you go faster. A great story about this. So I had a fantastic supervisor in grad school. His name was Ron Myers-Koff, and he just had like the most soothing, like he had the perfect therapist voice, basically. And he's the one who trained me to do bedside consultations in hospital settings, which is something a lot of psychologists do now. And he was telling me about a client he had who had conversion disorder or somatoform disorder. Essentially, they thought they were paralyzed, but they weren't. And that can happen when you have a lot of stress. And Rod just used his soothing therapist voice after, building a rapport with this person. And one day said, sometimes people who this happens to, they have things happen to them, like where they start to just like maybe feel a little tingling in their fingers, maybe prickling down in their toes. And then eventually they'll get to the point where they can, use all their limbs again. And he said over the course of the next week or so, the patient was like, I'm experiencing all those things that you said. And it was really just the power of suggestion, that almost like giving the person permission for this to happen. So yes, the mind is really interesting. The mind-body connection is really, really interesting. And we've underestimated this in the past. And the placebo effect is a really good example of that, right? Analog experiments used animals in the lab to observe behavior and try to then sort of make connections to human behavior sometimes, or in other cases, we're just trying to find out how animals think, for example. This is controversial because depending on what you're doing with the animals, right, it might be harmful. So for example, there were people who used rats where I went to grad school. I was not one of them. I did all my studies on people filling out questionnaires, so nothing harmful. And they actually would like put electrodes in the rats' brains and have them run mazes while they looked at their brainwaves. And they did it in as ethical a way as possible and tried to minimize pain, but clearly there are some people who are really disturbed by this. I remember we had like an all department email list, and we got an email one day that said, if you see a rat in the building, we don't have an infestation. One of the rats got away. And all the clinical people were like, go rat, go. Experimental people were like, oh no. So it certainly is controversial. Our neighbors at PETA, who have their headquarters in downtown Norfolk, would certainly disagree. But there are a lot of people who argue these need to be done. And you can do analog experiments in a way that's not invasive at all. So you can observe animals in the wild, for example, or things along those lines. All right, so just like everything else, even though it's the gold standard, experiments have both advantages and disadvantages. So you do have the ability to control the environment, much more so than other types of research. As a result, you become much closer to determining causality among the variables. And again, it's easier to get a large sample size compared to case studies. A lot of times, certain experiments you can run like groups of people, or you can turn them over pretty quickly. And now we're even able to do experiments online, where a person might just be exposed to one stimulus versus another, like a picture or what have you. Some disadvantages, although it's tempting to say, yes, I've discerned causality because you've done an experiment, there are always variables you can't control or anticipate. So, example here. So a common technique that's used in my subfield to look at how people react to the thin ideal that's out there, the idea that like we should all be skinny, for women we should just be really skinny, for men we should be like skinny and buff somehow, right? You show images of people who look like this, and then you have the participants sort of respond to them. So what some of my own research has showed is that we're assuming they're comparing themselves to these people, but if you don't ask them if they're actually comparing themselves, they in fact might not be, and you're not actually doing what you think you're doing. So it's really important to actually measure that, and often we include something like that that we call a manipulation check in an experiment, to be like, is it actually doing what we thought it was doing? In addition, some experiments by nature create artificial scenarios and environments. So you're having someone come into a lab setting, it's not in their environment. It's not in the real world. So what you measure might not be the same as what if you sort of observe people in the cast, right? Or something along those lines. And then experiments sometimes require deception, which can be really problematic. And we'll talk about that in a few slides. And sometimes there are just experiments you can't perform, right? There are certain things, like as we mentioned, that you have to do quasi-experiments because you just can't manipulate. And sometimes it's just, we can't figure out a good way to manipulate something. So that can make it a challenge. There's also what's called a single subject or a single case design. And these are essentially a hybrid of case studies and experiments. So they've been used to develop and test often therapy techniques within a scientific framework. So the same individual is studied over a period of time, and behavior at one point in time is compared to behavior at a later time, after an intervention or a treatment is expected. And the most common way to do this is what's called the ABAB design. And the A's and B's just represent different phases of the experiment. So the first A is baseline. So before you do anything, you just sort of check, where is this person on whatever I'm going to try to manipulate? B is where you introduce your IV, whatever therapeutic intervention you're trying to use. Then you take away the therapeutic intervention, because if it works, great, but you don't know because you've only got one person if that's why it's working, right? Maybe something else in their life also changed. So you take it away and demonstrate that you get the problematic behavior you're trying to change back, and then you'll put B back in. You reintroduce your IV, and then, if it's working, you just keep it going. So the example I always use is this case of Chris. So Chris was a 19-year-old female with severe developmental delays. So what this means is that essentially she was not cognitively at the same point as most 19-year-olds. And the vast majority of therapies for adults are really designed with people who have pretty high order thinking. You've got to really think about why you're doing something. Right, so clearly that wasn't going to work for Chris. And in addition to her developmental delays, she also had a disorder called trichotillomania. Not something you guys need to have memorized for a test, but people are often curious how to spell it, so I'll throw it in the chat. And this is actually, they've now classified this as an obsessive compulsive disorder. Where when you are anxious or stressed, you actually pull out your own hair. And you don't even necessarily realize you're doing it at the time. And for Chris, it left large bald spots. I had a student once who had trichotillomania, and I could tell how stressed she was by how much of her eyebrow was there. She would actually pluck her eyebrows. And one day she came in and was half her eyebrow was gone. So I was like, okay, what's going on? So they had to figure out a way that wasn't let's think about while you're doing this, right? And as you can see, her baseline is pretty long. So they were actually trying a whole bunch of different things. Usually your baseline would be a couple weeks. But clearly they were what can we do to help this person? And sometimes something would work for a week or two, but then it would just come back. And so what they did was actually a pretty simple and kind of cool technique. So they put 2.5-pound wrist weights on her. And when she was watching TV, that was one of the times where she would really manipulate her hair a lot. And so essentially, when she lifted her arm, because she had this lightweight wrist weight, she would notice that she lifted it. And so she would stop herself before she started hair pulling. So when she wore this weight, as you can see at B on this graph here, her manipulation of her hair, pulling of her hair actually went down to 0. Well, as you can see before, they had a couple times that had worked. So they needed to make sure that this was actually the thing that was working. So they took their weight off for a couple times. And as you can see, it goes back in the same range it was. And then they reapplied the weights and it went away. So sometimes in therapy, it's stupid things like this, really simple things that we can analyze and come up with higher order things all we want. But sometimes you just need to do a really simple behavioral manipulation, and that's what's going to work to help the person the most. Oh, Miranda, thanks for sharing. Yeah, excoriation disorder is in the same category as trichomania. Yeah, and it has to do with skin rather than your hair. Yeah, I had a client who had that. And in her case, it was really sad because she also had borderline personality disorder. And so her excoriation sort of became part of her self-harm. It was really sad. So hopefully you are getting help for yours. And yeah, we do have ways that can help, which is great. All right, so some other things we need to talk about. Each of these research methods only gives a snapshot, right, of what's going on, a little piece of what's going on. So Brunswick in 1956 recognized this and said that in addition to sampling participants, we should also sample different things. So types of domains. So we think about college students, for example. Well, we typically just get a convenient sample of who's in psych classes, right? But what if we just took all the students at Wesleyan, put them in a database, and had the computer randomly select people, and those were the people we recruited, right? We want to sample different methods of research. We want to make sure we're not always doing the same kind of study. So if we've been doing correlational study after correlational study, let's figure out an experiment and see if we can find similar results. Then we have different types of performances, several different ways of inducing a variable, as well as several different methods. So if we are going to do experiments, let's figure out different ways to manipulate the IV so we're not always just showing people images, right? So some of the more creative things they've done in my subfield is like have people try on swimsuits and stand in front of the mirror, or have people try on jeans that are purposely too tight or purposely too big, but told they're the right size, things along those lines. There are, of course, major challenges to doing this. It would be incredibly expensive and time-consuming for single researchers to do this, and especially if they were expected to do all of this before they could publish a paper, right? It would just be nearly impossible. So the solution that Funder, your author, suggests is that consider many studies performed by both the same and the different research labs over time. So instead of expecting one study to include all these things, we start to look at the body of the literature together. And one way we can do this is what's called meta-analysis. And meta-analysis involves coding information from each study's results. And essentially each study becomes like a participant. Each study is now its own data line in your data set. And by comparing multiple studies, combining multiple studies and comparing over studies, we're able to see trends over time and across multiple methods of research. So I have a published meta-analysis where I looked at things like social comparison as it relates to body dissatisfaction. And some of the stuff I talked about earlier were just comparing to the images versus measuring comes out of that meta-analysis. Other times meta-analysis gives us really interesting perspectives on what we think we're finding, but we're not. So for example, meta-analyses on brain studies sometimes show that like everything just kind of washes out when you combine all the data. Because often brain scan studies have really small samples, so you might find something you think is significant, but it's just sort of like a quirk. So meta-analysis can be really important. So when we run these studies, how do we determine if the results actually mean anything? We do testing with statistics to determine what's called statistical significance. If you've taken Psych 210, you will have done this, or math stats, you will know something about this. So the overarching term for the commonly used method is null hypothesis significance testing. It's really wordy, but that is our common term. And it essentially asks the question, what are the chances I would have found this result if nothing were really going on? So what are the chances essentially I found this by accident? The most common statistic of significance that we see is the p-level or the probability level. So p-level stands for probability level. And the p-level tells us the probability of getting a difference of that size that we found in our study using our statistical analyses if the actual size of the difference were 0. Typically, we tend to use p is less than 0.05. So essentially we set it at, there would only be a 5% chance that this was found by chance. There are some problems with these issues. One is that it's difficult to describe results. So technically our results give the probability the result would be found if the null hypothesis was true, instead of just saying like, we proved this, right? It's sort of awkward. And again, who decided that this 0.05 is the magic cutoff, right? Why not 0.06? Why not 0.10? Why not 0.01, right? So it's just sort of arbitrary. Another problem is that p-value only looks at what's called type 1 error. So this is saying that two variables have a relationship when they don't. So the idea here would be, like a analogy you can use is you spread a rumor that two people are dating who are actually not dating. Okay, that's type 1 error. P-value does not account for what's called type 2 error. And type 2 error means saying one variable is not in relationship with another variable when it is. So type 2 error is like, we're missing the fact that something actually exists. So maybe you assume two people are not dating, so you hit on that cute person of your desired sexuality. And maybe it turns out that they're dating a good friend of yours, and this may or may not be how I met my husband initially. But she set us up later, so it was okay. I didn't break the girl code. So like a year after they broke up, she's the one who set us up. Okay, type 2 error would have been super awkward if I'd just gone for it, right? Another issue is that even when results are statistically significant, that doesn't necessarily mean that the answer means anything. So it can be arbitrary. Sometimes we find very small differences. So what we also need to examine, especially in psychology, is whether it has clinical significance. So clinical significance means, does it actually make a difference in the person's life? Does it matter in the real world? So for example, if we were treating a disorder and we found that, our treatment made the depression fall 2 points and the other treatment made it fall 1 point. Well, it's a 40-point scale. Is that actually a meaningful difference to someone going through therapy? Maybe, maybe not, but we need to think about that. Does this actually help the person that we're trying to help, or is it sort of just something we find statistically? Another aspect of hypothesis testing that's often overlooked is effect size. Again, we can say two variables are statistically significantly related, but does that actually mean anything? Effect size lets us know how large that relationship is. So effect size lets us know how large that relationship is. Whether it's correlation or whether it's finding difference between groups, effect size lets us know that. There are many different statistics we can use to examine this. And one is just the correlation coefficient, which is designated just by a lowercase r. And this, you can actually take the results of experimental data and convert it to a correlation coefficient. However, with the correlation coefficient, it can be difficult to interpret what these actually mean. Another one that we see is to take the correlation coefficient and square it. So this will be called the square of r, or r squared. We use this quite a bit in regression, which is one of the extensions of correlation. And this gives you the percentage of variance explained by the result. And Funder says, this is confusing and misleading. He has no idea why we use this. Like, it seems really random to him. There's another variable that I've seen used most often, and that's called Cohen's d. And this is very commonly reported. It's somewhat comparable to the correlation coefficient. And it's essentially the difference between means divided by the standard deviation, but you can also make a correlation coefficient of Cohen's d. This is the one, again, we see most commonly reported within psychology. And then there's something called the binomial effect size display, where you look at how much of an effect an experimental intervention is likely to have and how well you can predict an outcome from individual measurement of difference. Thunder goes into this in a really lot of detail, so I'm not even going to repeat that as definition because it's really wordy. Just if you want to look it over in Thunder, go ahead. Essentially, I would just want you to know that this is another way to look at effect size. So it's really complicated. I've never seen anyone actually do it in a published study. Doesn't mean it's not out there. I just haven't. All right, we only have one more slide to go over, but it actually, because it's about ethics, will go really well with our discussion day on Wednesday. So we will just use that there. Alrighty, and we are at time, so y'all are free to go. And if anyone has questions, feel free to stick around and ask me.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Dr. Myers. Okay, so I ordered my textbook from Chegg, but I got an email this morning saying that I don't know if their department is pushed back because of COVID or whatever, but it says that my books won't be here till September 8th.
Oh, geez. Okay. Shoot me an email, and what I can do is I can scan the readings for Wednesday, because you're probably not the only one in that position, and I'll stick them on Blackboard. But email me so that I remember to do it.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.
Okay, I have a quick question because I tried to schedule the meeting that you wanted us all to have, the one-on-one, and I wanted to make sure it went through because when I did it, it loaded for a super long time, and I don't know if it ever
Let me
actually
take
got
a look. Do you remember when you made it for?
Yeah, for tomorrow at 1.
Tomorrow at 1. You're not on there, but what I'll do is make us a Google Hangouts meeting, and I'll send you a calendar invite that way.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks for checking. Yeah, I was having some network problems yesterday, even at home. So I think there's just everyone is trying to do everything online now. So
yeah,
everything.
Okay. Thank you.
Hi. I'm the one who emailed you.
Yes.
I just had a quick question about the assignment 1. Is it just a reading, or do we have to do anything for that?
So you're just doing the reading, and then we'll do the assignment in groups in class.
Oh, okay. Okay, cool. Thank you.
You're welcome.
See you on Wednesday.
See you Wednesday. What's the calendar? Yeah, I'll do that.